Welcome back to the Boss Ladies podcast, hosted by myself, Sualeha, and the wonderful Manasi. We're super excited for our guest today. I know we've talked to you a little bit before last week. We had some really interesting conversations, so I'm super excited to kick that off again now. Anna, if you could introduce yourself, that would be perfect.
Sure. Lovely to be here with both of you. And we certainly did have a wonderful conversation last week about what this podcast is all about and what you're looking to achieve. So I hope I live up to those expectations. My name is Anna Baird. I suppose I live sort of a multifaceted career life. My day work is with Google Cloud Technologies. I'm the head of culture and innovation for our customer success programs and line of business, I'll say. And then secondarily, I do a lot of work with startups. So I actually have my own sort of consulting business that's been around for a number of years. And I work with a number of early stage startups, especially in sort of the tech space around particularly SaaS products usually. And I often advise on marketing and sales capabilities in those early stages. So I guess that's a little bit about my work life. And then I have a wonderful family. I am both British and Canadian, so I have had the opportunity to live in both countries over the last number of years. And other than that, just a fan of spring arriving. So as you see, there's some sun in the background behind me and looking forward to some warmer weather.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. We'll jump right into it and just talk about some of your work at Google, because I think that's initially just like what drew us in is just your role. I think at the intersection of a lot of different groups. You work with customer success, but you also work in culture and innovation, which is definitely a really interesting dynamic. And so if you wanted to elaborate a little bit on that and talk about what your maybe daily role looks like at Google, sort of the types of people you interact with, and just elaborate more on that.
Absolutely. So I was very lucky when I joined Google about 4 years ago. A lot of the focus for, I guess, marrying what I would say were my skill set with where Google Cloud was as a business came down to two things: change management capabilities and how our customers are often thinking about whether it's making a transition into cloud, so they might be new to cloud, or we have certainly a large group of customers who are multi-cloud environments, and we sort of have everyone in between on the cloud journey continuum. And so change management is a huge part of that. And how we talk about, transformation is often mentioned, but there are different types of transformation. Business transformation, where you're really focusing on people, process, and technology. You have organizational transformation, where you're focusing largely on the people side of that transformation opportunity, but it often collaborates with or is in tandem with a technology shift. And then you have digital transformation, which sort of leads with the technology and the other parts follow. And so I think joining Google Cloud, when I did, it was sort of in its toddler phase where a lot had been learned from a capacity of what could Google Cloud learn from broader Google and the BETS companies, but also as sort of a B2B service within the Google sphere. And there are others beyond Google Cloud, but certainly Google grew up as a B2C environment. So it was really interesting to have that intersection between working with business customers in that B2B space, but trying to bring some of the innovation techniques and approaches and really the culture of innovation that lies within a company like Google. And so a couple of anecdotes, I think, when I joined the business, there was a getting up to speed on what is this sphere of Google and how does it work and how do employees interact with each other and what does it mean to be in an innovation mindset, and even just basics of what are the steps of innovation. And within Google and many other companies, the idea of empathetic design. So having our customers lead us. One of the things you hear a lot of people say at Google, which is very publicly known, is start with the user and all else will follow. And so having that mentality of who are you designing for and thinking about that individual, that group, that business, but then also mirroring your engineering, your sales team, your customer success team, mirroring your teams to reflect your customers is a really tough challenge. And so I think beyond learning about innovation, I've learned a lot at Google about people and teams and the behavioral science behind that motivation to be innovative and to solve users' problems and to be user-centric. And so I think one of the things that we were talking about last week when we were first discussing this conversation together was, especially right now where the world is with hybrid work, how are we constantly keeping the pulse sort of what our customers need from a business perspective, but also what do their employees need from an individual perspective. And I think we all have had to work and operate very differently over the last couple of years because of COVID and various other implications, whether they're weather related or politically related in the world. And so with a business like Google really trying to solve problems for everyone and accessibility for everyone and getting people useful information, which was the core of the business, and that extending into places like cloud, where being able to use data to form insights, whether it's about your customers or your employees or products, how do you make use of that data and how do you make sure that you understand what potential bias is in the data and how do you draw out that bias and make sure that the people using the data, collecting the data, crunching the data, understand what it means to look at it holistically, and how do you build a team so that you get different perspectives. So I guess I come back to, I think I sort of had a particular skill set coming into Google, and now in particular in the innovation space, learning about the structure around what innovation can look like. And when I use the word structure, it often surprises people because they say, well, shouldn't innovation happen spontaneously? And shouldn't it be something that really is carte blanche and starts from scratch? But I think what Google's done very well, and I think some startups do very well in my experience, is building that mechanism or the opportunity for people to do innovation and have a platform or have an approach for it so people feel comfortable being a part of that innovation cycle. And I think that comes down to making people feel respected and safe and have that ability to take chances and do that kind of work. So that's maybe the more of the psychological part. And then I think the structural part is really giving them, whether it's the time, the resource, even the education to be able to do it. So it's all very long-winded, but that was a little bit about coming on board to Google Cloud and then really getting to immerse myself in broader Google and Alphabet and learning from those experiences to bring to our client base, our customer base in Google Cloud.
I think that there's so much to unpack there, and I'll start, and I'm sure Sualeha will have things to add on, but I think you touched on a lot of things that like I personally value, and I know that I've learned like over the past 2 years. And it's just like hearing you say it is like I have so many questions just to ask you, because I think it's so interesting how instead of focusing on like the experiences you've had, you talked more about like the lessons you've learned and the principles that you've sort of adopted into your own way of thinking, and even things like empathetic design, right? And thinking like user-centric and designing products for accessibility is things that aren't very, I don't know, like they're not things that you necessarily think of, but when you think of huge corporations, it's like that's the reason they're so big, is because they're serving such a large audience. And when you focus on things like accessibility, you're indirectly making such a huge impact, because I feel like we're often thinking about like the first layer of customers, just the people who are in our immediate surroundings, but we're not thinking about like the broader scope of impact and, you know, who are the people that we really need to get on board, right? Like maybe everyone in a certain area is using Google, but who isn't using Google, and what do they need for us to start using Google? And I think like asking those questions is a really interesting thought process. And I think it'd be really interesting to just like break down empathetic design and accessibility and some of those things. So I have a few questions for you, but I guess one of them is just like diving into the whole idea of like empathetic design. I think that's like so interesting because I've heard like user centric, right? Or like impacting with the user in mind, but like empathetic design sounds so personal in a sense. And so hearing it put that way is just so interesting to me. So I'm curious, like, how do you like be mindful? I guess it's more of like a, mindset, like a framework type thing of when you're designing, but how do you have, a team sort of all aligned on these same principles of like empathetic design, user centric impact, and like be very much so on the same page when coming up with ideas and when working on projects? Because I feel like if everyone isn't sort of at that baseline, it's really hard to communicate and have those conversations. And so I wonder, like, as a team, how do you sort of define that for yourselves and sort of maintain that like definition of what it means to design empathetically?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And let me preface by saying a lot of the work that Google generally has made public in terms of the approach to innovation and some of our design thinking has been in collaboration with a lot of great partners, IDEO, Harvard Business School, Stanford. So they're beyond Google. I will say that we are very often excited about and always thinking about who are partners out there, because we've learned a lot through our business, which has been made public on YouTube through various videos or things we've shared on our rework site. For those interested listening to the podcast, there's an incredible website called Rework, and it has a host of material of projects and research studies and white papers and things that Google has made public for other companies and individuals to look at and understand basically just what's behind the curtain. So we call it open sourcing, and that's a big part of sort of Google culture in general, and has certainly threads into how Google Cloud operates as part of that. And so I think coming back to sort of how do we get on the same page internally? How do we all speak the same language? And a lot of it has resulted from the empathetic design thinking methodology, which in 5 steps is broken down across Google. And of course, different lines of business, different areas of Google might leverage it for different reasons, but it all comes back to sort of the value base that we have at Google and how we think about respecting our user, respecting opportunity, and respecting one another, which are the 3 respects that Google was built off of. And so I'll just sort of briefly walk you through what those steps look like, and then I'm sure there will be things we want to click into, but it starts with empathy, with empathizing. So observing, engaging, immersing ourselves in what the challenge is, what the problem is that our user, and in some cases our customer, has, and then being able to really define that. So it comes down to, expression, communication of the problem and the points of view that we're hearing. And then we shift into that ideate mode. And that's really about, identifying the problems to enable us to find some solution opportunity. And then we're big on prototyping. So one of the things you'll see very publicly about how Google talks about our culture is launch and iterate. Our Google X being part of Google and Bets, which is a space that a lot of our startup and innovation businesses grow within sort of the Google sphere. There's a whole piece around what we call roof shots and moon shots. And roof shots are obviously closer to us, fewer steps, are more tangible. Moon shots are the really far out there. Are we turning an industry upside down? Are we changing the way people do things on a regular basis? But you have to have those lofty goals, and you have to have what we call 10x thinking to get you there. And so this prototyping capability and the ability to launch something, gain feedback, gain momentum, go back, iterate off of it, go back, break some things, rebuild some things. Like you could almost, the visual of it, you can almost envision sort of a box of Lego, and then each Lego piece, as you build something new. And then every time you take pieces out and replace them with different pieces, it's similar but different in structure. And so that's really that getting ideas out there into the world, testing it, having that fast pace, And in that sphere is failure. And one of the biggest things that I think we all grapple with as humans is, well, when I fail, first of all, how does that make us feel? But then what do I do? How do I learn from that? How do I make sure that if I do this again, if I try something similar, if I try something different, what have I learned from this experience that I can take forward with me? And so that idea of where failure lives and how it's experienced. And I'd love to hear from both of you, in your school, in your environment with the Knowledge Society, what does failure look like and how is it talked about? Because I think that's a big part, especially for customers and individuals that I work with in the Google Cloud business, is how do we talk about our failures and how do we have a culture where failure can be discussed and failure can be learned from? And then the fifth step is really testing, and you test and learn and you repeat, and sometimes you land things and sometimes things aren't sticky, or you need to go back to the drawing board. But that's really, those 5 steps really make up that empathetic design. And a big part of it is that failure piece. So I'll pause there because you both probably have interesting stories, but that's a big part of culture in general at Google is, having the failures teach us things that make us better so that we can build better products, better services for individuals, for communities that we live and work in.
Yeah, there's so much to break down there. Like I can break down every single step, right? But I think it's really powerful that you really emphasized failure, because failure, there's a lot of stigma around it. At least I grew up with a lot of stigma around failure. Like it's something that you usually want to avoid, something that we're averse to. But at Google, I think failure is celebrated, right? So what we've learned is that part of the Google Access culture is to kill ideas. So like you can see killing ideas as something that's negative. That's a failure, but no, it's something that's celebrated. You want to kill those ideas because by killing those ideas, you're bringing forth higher quality ideas that can be executed on, and you're eventually creating something that would be more impactful and a lot better of an iteration than it would have been beforehand. And so for my own experience, it's interesting that you mentioned moonshots, because within TKS, we've also worked on our own moonshot projects. So one of my failures, or like a team failure that I was in, was actually for our moonshot project. So we were originally trying to go solution first for one of our projects. So we're looking at neural machine computing. It was super, super niche, but we're like, this is so innovative. Like, this is obviously moonshot. It hasn't been deployed. Like, what can get more moonshot than this? But the more research we did, we were like, there isn't a direct application for this. So even though it's very moonshotty, it doesn't have actual impact because it's very moonshotty. So we took steps back and went through like problem identification and everything. And so even though like our deck necessarily wasn't like the most glamorous one, we ended up having like a really high quality of research by going problem first, and it ended up being probably one of the best in terms of like content, because we were looking at solving or addressing plaque buildup and people's arteries. So that was just a experience that I was thinking of when you mentioned that.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. No, please go ahead.
I was just gonna say, adding on to Sualeha, I think Sualeha brought up an interesting point of like going very much so solution first, and sort of that incentive I think a lot of people have to go solution first, because I think oftentimes the exciting part about industry and just like deploying products is actually deploying the product and like what you're getting out there. And I think like personally, I have been in that position so many times, because you're told over and over again, like, no, be problem centric, like focus on the problem, break down the problem, understand the problem, but you never really like know when you're done with that. And so you keep jumping ahead, and then you're like, wait, this isn't going to work. And you come back to the problem and you break it down a little bit more, and then you jump ahead and you're like, no, why did I jump ahead? And you come back, and it's like that back and forth. And so really like understanding what it means to break down a problem is such an important skill. And I can't think of a specific example. I feel like I have so many stories about just like being very solution first. I could, spend all day talking about them, but I think that's just such an important point, and something you were talking about as well in terms of like Google's process is not to be solution oriented, because that's such an enticing thing to do. And it's like, it seems counterintuitive, but at the same time, it's very natural, just because we live in a world where everything's just seen sort of at face value, and oftentimes we don't see the process that goes behind developing certain things. I think it's amazing that, you know, companies like Google and so many other companies are open source and are really sharing their progress and also their failures. But I feel like that's definitely something that's more recent. I think even just like in the past decade, that's not something we saw publicly be shared very often. So I think the fact that we're sharing more information about the process and failures that are happening, as well as obviously like milestones, but I think that's definitely a recent development, because it like seems to me that even like 5 or 10 years ago, that's not something that was really talked about. But it should be talked about, because I think everyone honestly just sees the end result and we want that, and we don't really understand what it means to get there.
Yeah, it's, I think also too, our world over the last 2 years has actually allowed us, it's hindered a lot of the things that we were used to in everyday life. So let me start with, you know, and the pandemic is still with us in many sense, especially in certain parts of the world. And so it's not even a passé situation. We're still living it. We're still living in this sort of multi-world, whether it's work environment or personal environment for many people. But I think one of the things that I, in my humble opinion, have noticed more and more is the transparency of companies as they're making shifts to adapt to the environment. And it's almost because the world was experiencing the pandemic together, not necessarily in the same way. In fact, not in the same way. There were many, whether it was geographical regions or epicenters, that were experiencing different things, but we were all experiencing a pandemic as a whole. And in some ways that allowed for this opportunity to say, we are all having to make shifts. What they look like might be different, but we're all having to make shifts and accommodations, and especially with, you know, regulatory aspects of it, and health protection, et cetera. And so I think a lot of companies in these shifts that were somewhat forced could be a little bit more transparent, Google inclusive. And certainly startups, a number of startups that I worked with were much more transparent about, you know, whether it was with their users to say, we're just not there yet with the engineering and here's why, or whether it was with their customers to say, we thought we'd have this offering, but given the current climate, given the circumstances, given the labor, given, you know, many reasons, given the financials, we can't get there quite yet, or we thought we would be able to make this work and the product's broken, or the service is broken, or the labor, the chain of labor isn't working. So I think almost because of that spread of us all needing to change our everyday work and personal environments collectively, people felt more comfortable equally in their personal life being more open and transparent about whether it was family or friends or, you know, loved ones they were caring for, or pets, or even not, you know, even being in different home environments, because people shifted around for childcare, for schooling, people were just trying to make things work. And so people were, even in their personal lives, more transparent, more honest. Before we started recording, you know, my cat, as you both saw, was walking up and down the desk. And those were things, and I mentioned to you both that back when, you know, prior to the pandemic, I might have felt that wasn't the most professional way to show up on a call such as this. But because of our experiences in the pandemic, being more transparent and open and honest about home life, work life, the harmony between them, it's almost made some of that professionalism different. And I think I was mentioning to you both the campaign for what, you know, the new professional looks like very much embodies the similar feelings I have about how companies are showing up now and being more open about things that they're trying, things that they're failing on, things that they're unclear about the impact it's going to have, but they're going to trial and error. And I hope I hope we continue to shift that way so that we can learn, we can share learnings. It's still a competitive world out there. So sharing learnings is also a currency, and you don't necessarily want to be doing that with your competitors. But I think there is an element to, can we build for the greater good in certain industries? And I think with the pandemic, we've seen in the healthcare industry, the more that is shared, the more that we can spread across, academics and corporate environments and really rally together. Look what can be made possible. So maybe we can keep that spirit. I'm optimistic we can keep that spirit, hopefully moving forward.
Yeah, I really like that for a lot of reasons. So one thing you touched on was just breaking down and redefining what professionalism means. And so I like that because I feel like the pandemic has allowed people the freedom and given them permission to be more human, to show that, we all have personal lives. We all make mistakes. Life isn't always very clean, very structured. And I like that trend because I feel like it just is like a more encouraging and more healthy environment. Because at some point, I feel like when we, I don't know, try to be too rigid or too perfect, you lose that authenticity. And I feel like being more authentic and transparent and talking about mistakes just makes it easier to foster connection between different groups of people.
Yeah,
Definitely.
absolutely.
I think the other thing I would add to that, and it was sent to me recently, is you sort of have three brains. I think you have the head, which is really that strategic, cognitive. You have the gut, which is more of that emotional appeal, and then you have the heart, which is also emotional, but often led by circumstance or bias in some cases, or past experience. And so where the gut has that emotional lead, where you're kind of learning about your surroundings and you're making decisions in the moment, the heart is really about, well, what have you learned in the past and how do you make a decision based off of that? And then the head tries to regulate between the two to say, well, this is the logic and this is the data to back it up. And so if you think about those three brains competing, and we're all human, like we're all trying to do the best for ourselves, our surroundings. In some ways, we're quite selfish in that sense. It's really hard for those competitive brains to land on, and this is how we can work together, and this is how we can think differently, and this is how we can be inclusive and bring, an equity so that people have a say, people can feel comfortable in their own skin, people can help contribute to creating a product which will make it better for the world because we have multiple perspectives. So I think it comes back to our basic environment, our how we live as people. And then what does that mean when we show up to do the work that we do? And especially in the tech space, being careful about what that means when we take products and services to market, whether it's at Google or anywhere else, that poking holes in, are we doing the best we can? Are we bringing perspectives around the table that can really give difference of opinion? And I think one of the things I was mentioning to you both, which I think is super cool about Google's environment, maybe differently from where I might have worked in the past or worked with startups in the past, is the disagree and commit concept, and how when people don't necessarily see eye to eye, how do you find a way forward? Because you have to take a product to market, you have to make services work if they're broken. And so if you're, as a team, not necessarily agreeing on what the solution is, how do you bring the solutions together, decide which solution is the best of them? And then if it's not yours and you're very passionate about it, you have to step aside from the ego and the investment you have in your ideas, and you have to collaborate and get on board with someone else's idea. Sometimes that can feel uncomfortable. And so that can be hard. It can be hard to back something you don't necessarily fully agree with. So I think learning those types of things is a big part of the culture that you're embedded in your work environment, especially, in my view, especially for me.
Yes, just as a response to what you were saying, I think it's really interesting that this pandemic has allowed us to sort of explore that transparency. And I've been thinking about this while you were sort of talking, and something that came to mind was just like a lot of like just social movements we've had, and I think how they might have influenced just the perspectives we have also in the tech world, right? So there's been so many social movements going on, especially in 2020, and sort of like branching off of that. And I think a lot of those have inspired us to seek more global perspectives and perspectives from more diverse communities. And I think that has played a really important role in like accessibility of products, which is something you were talking about earlier, and something I know we were talking about last week, is how Google has been really intentional about adding that component into products and continuously working on iterating products to serve more people that we don't necessarily think of as a society, and don't necessarily serve as well as we could be doing. And so I think just how this pandemic has spiraled into something more than obviously a global disaster, but into also this new, I guess, paradigm of what innovation and what, including different voices means, not only in social movements and policy, but also in the world of tech and innovation.
Yeah, there's definitely, and let me start by saying, I think one of the things I really enjoy about working with colleagues at Google and the Alphabet companies, and in particular, the experiences I've had in Google Cloud, that nobody is perfect, and often there are all of those expressions. You're never going to please everyone. You can't design for everyone, and expect, or you can try to design for everyone, but you can definitely expect healthy feedback, and challenges coming back your way, because no one is perfect. And so I think the nice part about learning, especially when you're trying to build and live a culture in innovation, is understanding that there are going to be those challenges. You might come up with an MVP that you launch and think we've looked at every angle, and there are always going to be those adjacency use cases, those new opportunities. There are going to be shifts in the landscape, as you rightly pointed out, whether it's politically, financially, from a physical perspective. Are there considerations around weather or health? Like, we've seen a lot of these, I guess I'll call them experiences, hit us at once over the last couple of years across the globe. And so whether it was wildfires and the pandemic, or it was flooding and the pandemic, or it was the pandemic and financial markets going crazy, there were all of these layers. And so I think part of the accessibility piece, at least in my opinion, and especially working with certain startups, was all about finding great talent and now being able to use that talent in a more virtual setting. Whereas before, there was sort of a physical aspect to hiring, a physical aspect to getting the work done, a regional aspect of this individual has to be in the same or the right or the close time zone to mine in order to get the work done. And I think what we learned is there are these opportunities to flex and use collaborative tools, some of which we offer through Google, some of which are offered through other businesses that we know well and use every day, and being able to use those platforms to collaborate, to share. The idea of the working day hours, the idea of the time clock, the idea of the physical meetings has changed. It hasn't gone away, but it's just changed. And so one of the things I'm very proud of and a huge proponent of is the ability through our workspace environment to have team members work on a similar presentation or a similar spreadsheet. We call sheets, slides. We call our presentation forum, and the three of us could be working at all different hours of the night, the morning, and adding comments, and we can see one another's comments, and we can work together, and we can not override, but we can add layering to those documents. And what used to frustrate me when I was in consulting was having to send out, individual presentations, getting feedback, and then having to marry that feedback myself. And often, quite hilariously, there would be individuals who would contradict one another, but they didn't know they were contradicting one another because they couldn't see the work progress. And so having those written capabilities to see, oh, actually these 2 points contradict, and how do we disagree and commit, as I was sharing earlier. But also language, how do we get on the same page with language? And we globally, as a global team, no matter what business you're in, if you're multinational or global, which a lot of us are tending to go that way now in the tech space, how do we make sure that we do our best with language challenges? And a very good example of that is how Google grew up. Part of some of the work that we've shared publicly is how the search engine grew up, and how it started in very basic terms. But Google's view was, it's our problem if there's, if someone misspells a name. It's our problem if someone uses a name that is also a noun, but and is an adjective, as an example. Or it's our problem if there are different connotations to a word. So these were all things that that a user might do using the search engine. And Google's perspective was, well, we have to solve for that. That's something we have to fix for them. We can't just say, well, they misspelt it, or they put in a name and they meant it to be, something different. So it was a proper name versus a noun. So all of these considerations and designing for that at its core just shows you that you really have to think differently about the people that you're serving. But then you do have to continuously poke holes, because as people start to use whatever it is that you've created, they're going to find new and different challenges. And it's up to you as the creator to meet them where they are. And so I think, coming back to accessibility, one of the things I love is the fact that a lot of these collaboration tools and capabilities now have speaking format like we are today. There are annotations often, or you can get transcripts now. In some cases, you can get multilingual capabilities. So if you have individuals around your team, and while there are often a lot of conversations about how things would start in English and then get translated, there are capabilities for other languages to be the base language, and to translate it back. So I think there are just some cool things like that, where we made some assumptions before, and now we're starting to say, well, why don't we just build these features? Why don't we have these capabilities so that people can use the right mediums of communication or the right ways of collaboration that suit them now in this new world? So I love that one of the benefits, or one of the silver linings, I shouldn't say benefits, a silver lining coming out of 2 years of being in a pandemic and still living in a pandemic, is that we've recognized that, and the fact that we do need to ignite more capabilities to bring equity to conversations, bring equity to working together. And that's something that, Google is very big on, but equally a lot of the startup tech companies that I've had the privilege of working with want to embed that from the beginning. What does diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging look like? And how do we make sure that that is woven into our everyday workings as a team, as a company, versus trying to include it on the back end once a culture is built?
Yeah, there's several key components I sort of wanted to touch on. And one of them was the fact that, you don't just release something and be done with it. Obviously, done is better than perfect, which is something I know you hinted at a little bit before, and it's important to build in public and release things and actually just sort of monitor the user's experience and then go back and iterate it and improve the product, and then, you know, release another version, continuously keep doing that. And so that idea of like, don't just settle for it and don't just be done with it, but actually take it and poke holes in it and try to find like loopholes in your own product. Like talk to people, talk to users to understand what users want. And I know even with just like the search bar example, I know we were talking about that last week, and I thought that was just such an interesting example, because you would think you have this, you know, really amazing search engine that can do so many things. You can, you know, literally search up anything you want. But it's not necessarily meeting the user where they are when you don't have those capabilities for it to understand what the user wants, because you're not taking into account, you know, the language that the user might speak, or, you know, their spelling, or maybe just like even, you know, the way they spell things in different countries, right? You might spell a word differently, and taking ideas like that into account. So obviously, you know, releasing this amazing like product, but, you know, breaking it down even further and saying, okay, we've released this thing, but how can we make it better and how can we 10x it, is really important. And I think I'm glad that you touched on that. And another thing was also diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how that's not just like something we should have at the surface level, but something that's actually fully integrated and woven into the culture of Google, because it's not something you just see on the surface. I think obviously diversity, equity, inclusion ties in with accessibility, and it's something that's part of every step of the process, right? Like even the whole idea of you release this product, but you take it back and you iterate it to serve a certain community or to serve certain groups of people. I think that's just really important, because that's not something you do for like, you know, it's like you can do it just to say like we're being inclusive, but it's also like it's a key component of like obviously the users and also the company. It's like, who are you really serving? Because I think every company is defined by the people that they're serving and the amount of people they're reaching and the amount of impact they're making on people. So having that be an actual component of the culture, rather than just, you know, a label that you slap on a product and you say, no, oh, we're being inclusive, oh, we have a diverse group of voices, that doesn't really mean anything until it's really like fully part of the process. And I think obviously, you know, in the past 2 years with just the pandemic, I think we've seen the rise of ideas like DEI, and how companies and just people are starting to integrate these ideas into their everyday work. But I think at the same time, there's this sort of misunderstanding of what it means to be diverse, and include diverse voices, definitely in the development of products, but even just in policy and so many other, you know, facets of society. We sort of have like this lack of understanding of what it really means. And I think just breaking it down and understanding what that looks like in every part of the process is really important.
Definitely. The other thing I think that is sometimes really hard to swallow, and I find this as well, is you absorb so much from your surroundings. Like I think about one of my daughters who's 2.5, and she, you know, she takes in everything. She watches my actions. She watches my partner's actions. She, you know, takes in vocabulary. She learns things from her friends at school. And we're all very much like that in different ways. Like we're very much sponges of our environment. Certainly we have other aspects that shape us. And so being surrounded by people who care deeply about you, but will, you know, challenge directly and feel that comfort to do that. That may sound familiar to you, because Kim Scott, who is a huge part of building Google's culture and people environment, often talks about that, and how having that comfort to be able to challenge the norm, or I think as I put it to you in my words, break things and rebuild things, or break things and start from scratch, and being able to really put that out there. It's not that you are discounting what the person or the team is, what they've put in front of you, but you're trying to help them think differently, or push the boundaries, or bring a new perspective. And so I think I feel empowered being able to work in teams like that. And again, none of us are perfect, and we have challenging days where communication just doesn't quite work, or the mediums we're using just don't quite get us to where we need to. And that can be frustrating. but being able to call that out and to shift and to change the mentality, or to start fresh, or to find ways to have those conversations is what takes you forward. And I think the other thing, just as I was hearing you talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, is not holding things so close to the chest that you don't let them take on a life of their own. And that's really hard, because I think a lot of us take a lot of pride in what we build and what we put out there and how we're seen. And I think image is a huge part of everyday life. And so letting go and having a product, as an example, take on a life of its own, and having users be a part of that, the building block, can be really hard and challenging and frustrating and angering and all of those emotions. But sometimes you get the best product out of it. And so one of the examples that has been made public, especially from a Google perspective, is just all about maps and how maps developed largely with the help of users, particularly in areas where, for whatever reason, Google camera imaging, we've all seen the cars, I think, with the cameras on top, which are probably now, Waymo autonomous, like no one's actually driving them, they're driving themselves, which is super cool for other reasons. But, places where Google couldn't necessarily go and do the right photographing or get the right imagery, and really leaning on communities, cities, communities is the best way I can describe it, to say, you tell us what maps should look like in your area. Like you tell us what those streets are. What don't we know? I lived in the UK for a long time, and there were these incredible back alley routes and things that if you've been there, you often hear talk about the black cabs, which is just such an icon for London in particular, but the UK in general, and how drivers of those cars know these incredible routes that are literally like the tiniest alleyways or places that you can sneak through to get quickly in traffic. And these are all the things that you can do your best as a creator of a product to try and capture something as simple as a nook, a street that is adjacent to a main road that might be plugged or clogged because of traffic. But you also need users to tell you, does that actually work? Is that a dead end? Did that street disappear when a new building went in? So maybe it's confidence. I don't know if that's the right word. Maybe it's comfort. Maybe it's openness. Maybe it's transparency. Maybe it's all of the above. But be willing to let users be a part of the creation also gets you that many steps further. Now that's easier said than done with certain products and services. So let me stamp that out there right now and say, I like caveat that and say, I get that. It's easy for me to say, well, we should all do that all the time. But there are some examples where we can, and we can let things take on a life of their own so that they serve best the needs of those we're trying to service. It seems really logical, but it's that, can you let it go? And can you let some of the control go to your user base? And that's a really hard thing to do, I think, as a creator, as someone building a product or a service.
Yeah, one thing I'm curious about is when you mentioned having the user be a part of that process, part of the creation. How do you guys make sure that the users that you're talking to, like there's also a diverse array of users, right? How do you make sure it's not people from the same background, giving the same feedback, those types of things? And I think that connects back to DE&I. And also, my hypothesis is the more diverse users that you talk to, the higher the quality your product would be, because there'd be more iteration to that particular product.
For sure. I think it's a tough, there are probably many layers that I'm going to miss, so forgive me. I think it's a tough thing to get, how many users do you need? And also not having them all be friendly users. So they're sort of first out of the gate, or first go users who want to get their hands on your new product and service right away and want to give you feedback, and often those are friendly users because they're so excited about your product or service anyway, that they're not necessarily going to always give you the gritty, very challenging feedback. And so beyond backgrounds and experiences and communities and languages and all of the different ways that we show up as individuals, what makes me unique versus the likes of both of you. So beyond all of those things about the people, then there's also, well, what type of user are they? Are they someone that would never use our product or service, but we've asked them to do it because we want to understand, well, why? Is it a barrier to use? Is it that we have made it too complicated? Is it that you don't like the brand? Like, what are those reasons that you wouldn't necessarily be a user? You have to have those people in the field testing. You have to have the people who scream the loudest and sometimes are critics. You have to have the people who don't necessarily believe in the product or service and actually advocate against it. So you have to have a mix of all of those layers of field testing, I'll say, to have, I think, the best shot at designing for everyone and making more people than not pleased with what you built. And so I think there are many ways to do that, not just at Google, but certainly in startup world, there are what I'll call like control groups that you can pay for that type of feedback. There are groups that sign up for free because they want to be a part of your journey as a product or a service or a business. There are individuals who are studying what you're trying to do. And so there's sort of an academic side to it. So I think it depends in so many circumstances. It's a makeup of those different worlds. But at bare minimum, I think having your building group be the group that says, we don't have enough testers who fit this type of profile. Your building group can't look and feel and sound like you. I can't have Anna Bairds around the table because they're going to give the same feedback in a lot of ways that I would have, whether that's from their experience, from their background, from their academics, from their language, whatever it might be. And so one of the things I think that's not always done perfectly well, but that you have to take the best shot at, is having a number of people evaluate talent. And one of the things that Google does, which is very public, is how they hire people. There's a whole process, and there are a number of individuals involved in the hiring process, so that it's not just one person's perspective. And it's not even just one business unit's perspective. There are often people involved in the interview process that have nothing to do with what you're being hired for, whether it's product or line of business, whether it's in Google or in one of the bet companies. So you get a spread of people evaluating you on multiple arenas, whether it's the actual, the role requirements, is one type of interview, and then sort of your cognitive abilities is another type, and then how you think and talk about the culture that you'd be joining, and what are you bringing to that, but also how likely are you to embed yourself in what the startup's about or what Google's about. So having, I think, the diversity of individuals who are looking at the hiring process helps you get different groups of people, different perspectives, and no one's ever done that perfectly. And every company I've ever worked with has done things really well in certain arenas and had some major issues in others. So I think we're still, as businesses, trying to figure it out, but just recognizing that you need to continue to push and continue to work and continue to look. And when your employees say, there's a gap here, we need to refocus as a business, we need more support, more focus on whether it's a particular group of people or whether it's a particular arena of customer, then acting on that, which can be really hard to do quickly in a big company. And so as honest as team members can be, that's where change starts to happen. And I think the core of that is psychological safety, which is a big part of Google. So maintaining that and being a leader that maintains that is something I try and do daily. And some days I'm really good at it, and other days I need to do better.
I really like how you mentioned how holistic it was, right? I think that was a theme you mentioned earlier, having diversity, equity, and inclusion at every step throughout the entire process. I like how you listed different examples from whether it was field testing for users or whether it was hiring and making sure there was diverse perspectives for the hiring process. And one thing that I thought was notable was that you're looking at how well that person will embed themselves into the culture. Will they contribute to the culture? Because I feel like there's a large push for being very capable skill-wise, having technical skills, but it's also very, very valuable to see how you integrate yourself into a particular environment. Do you elevate the people around you? I think that's something that's really important. I think it's something that's not discussed often enough, at least in the professional world, from my experience. But I actually wanted to ask a question from something we touched on a little bit earlier. So we're talking about failure. And so when I think of failure, I also think of risk, because I was thinking of when you kill ideas. So I'm curious to hear your perspective on what do you think is like the relationship between taking risks to push innovation and also trying to mitigate failure? Because when you fail, I'm sure there are certain resources you have to expend and stuff like that. But something else I also think of is I've heard this phrase that if you're have over 70% of the data points when you're making a decision, it's you're doing something that's too obvious and you're not taking a real risk, which isn't actually beneficial. So I feel like I'd love to hear your thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting about the 70%. I'm not sure I'm going to have great numbers or data for you, because I think the unfortunate answer is it sort of depends on what it is that you're trying to do, and how big of a risk is it in comparison to how big of a failure it could be. One thing that came to mind as you were asking me that question is, which is very, I think, simple from a consumer perspective, although most of us haven't been traveling up until recently. But I think if we think back to, 5 or 6 years ago, maybe even more, when Wi-Fi on airplanes started to become something that you could purchase, or in some cases was wrapped into sort of what you paid for your ticket. And forgive me, give me a little leeway with this, because I think it'll bring me back to my answer. But originally having, internet access on an airplane was really thrilling. It was, we were all very excited about it. Maybe we did work, maybe we watched videos, no judgment either way. But I think in travel in particular, and especially for airlines, that was just such a big innovation to be able to have something like that. And then slowly, more airlines got it, more passengers were giving feedback about it. Was the signal good? Was it on every aircraft? Things like that. And then slowly it went from being this new innovative thing to being table stakes, where if you would get on a plane that didn't have it, you'd wonder why. Like, is this an older plane? Is it because the airline isn't investing in it? And then it very quickly became a frustration for some people because they expected it and then they didn't get it, or they did get it, but it wasn't a great signal. So they couldn't stream their favorite TV show, or they couldn't do work, or whatever it might be. So I bring up that example because I think the idea of risk and opportunity versus failure, you do have to, in that risk assessment, have that understanding of, if there is failure or failures out of the testing, what is the magnitude of it? And is it something that you can, fix through launch and iterate, or is it something that really stops people where they are and they cannot move forward? They can't do something, they can't act on something. And so for certain products and services, coming to a grinding halt is just not an option. One being in our healthcare system, like if the machines came, that were keeping people breathing or keeping blood flowing, if those came to a halt, that's, that is life or death, literally. And so a healthcare, a medical devices company might say to me, the risks here are literally life and death, as an example. Whereas launching and iterating on a SaaS technology that's maybe used for customer relationship management, sure, people are going to get frustrated, but no one's physical being is necessarily at risk. And so I think certain industries are going to have different thresholds, especially with regulatory bodies, and things that are out of our control here on this phone. But I guess coming back to the percentage you sort of threw out there, I think what we see a lot of data around is the risks being taken, so the number of risks, as it goes up exponentially, you then see the next phase of sort of the failures and learnings. And it's really that third bar, which is after some of the failures and the learnings, what are the next iterations of those risks? So do they continue, or was it bad enough that it failed the first time that it can't continue that way? And so in my world, especially because I don't directly work in the healthcare space, I help companies in that space. Understanding places like where their data, as an example, if the data is wrong, what it really does to their business. Healthcare is going to be very different than construction. Construction is going to be very, very different from banking and financial services. So I think for me, I root myself in, and orient myself in the industry, and then the percentages of what risks we can take to how many failures we can adjust from to places where we need to be more careful. It's sort of like a mathematical equation dependent on who I'm talking to. And I think Google embodies that a lot, where there are certain arenas we have to be very, very careful in terms of how we launch and iterate and what are the backups. And if we had to revert to the previous, could we do that quickly? And what resources and teams does it take to do that? And then I think in other circumstances, just coming back to search as an example, there are some funny stories in the history of Google search where something's broken and it's made some users very frustrated and angry. And then as it's been fixed, it's come back, ideally, hopefully, in a better form. But that frustration and that anger and that disappointment was there and lived, but it was short-lived, and you came back with something cooler, better, more interesting, more exciting. And so you were sort of forgiven. That's a bit about Google search. That's not necessarily something we can apply to everyone in every industry. Not a great answer, but that's sort of my experience with that. Is the evaluation, the mathematical equation really belongs to what industries am I working in, and how are their ways of working currently, and what is digestible to them and their customers has to be the threshold.
No, I liked hearing your specific perspective and the experiences that you had. I think experience is always very powerful to listen to. The main themes like I caught on to is like obviously constant evaluation, reiteration. It can be situational, right? So I think it's just that process of, it's not necessarily like a hard and fast rule, and there are always like things that are constantly changing, which change is good, right? Because if there isn't any change, it means there's no growth. Then where's the innovation at, right? So that makes a lot of sense to me, that it is a constant process and a constant thing that you guys are always reevaluating. And I think this is like a really good stopping point. And I've actually really liked talking to you. I feel like we've gained a lot from being able to hear about your experiences at Google, from everything from innovation to diversity, equity, inclusion, and also just personal life. Like, what does it mean to be a professional? What does it mean to be a human being, right? So thank you so much for your time. And I hope you get a chance to talk again, actually. Yeah, that'd be perfect.
Yeah, thank you so much.
It's honestly been a pleasure. Thank you both for the invitation, and kind of exciting ahead of International Women's Day. It's very cool to be in a conversation where we're talking about the future, and both of you were telling me about your education and experiences, not just with the Knowledge Society, but South by going next week to speak and be a part of different arenas where you can help scale your teachings and your learnings. So thank you, and look forward to maybe a future or maybe being able to suggest other speakers that you can click into and talk to in a similar light.
Yes, we'd love that. Thank you so much.